That evening, Faye was hunched over her weathered journal, tucked into the deepest shadows of the king's private training gallery, while the rest of the pack celebrated the harvest. She never imagined she would be sensed, much less by the predatory instincts of Alpha King Jax himself. In her panicked scramble to vanish back into the corridors, she committed the ultimate act of self-destruction. She left the book behind, the journal where she had chronicled the rot at the heart of the council, the treachery of the king's own blood, and the devastating secret poetry she had written about Jax's golden eyes and the lethal grace of his stride. Now paralyzed by the weight of her exposure, she kept to the servant tunnels and avoided the throne room, her skin crawling with the uncertainty of his silence. Did he know? Was he savoring her humiliation, or was he waiting for the perfect public moment to crush the guard's daughter who dared to have a voice? The moon cast silver, barred shadows through the high windows of her small room as she reached for a fresh scrap of parchment, her hand trembling. Faye dipped her nib into the ink, the scratch of the metal against the page, the only sound in the silence. She began to write with the desperate intensity of a girl who knew she was already a ghost. Today, the theater of the absurd continued, she scrawled, her ink heavy and dark. I watched Silas perform his greatest role yet, the concerned advisor. She pressed the pen so hard the tip nearly snapped, a reflection of the fire burning beneath her quiet exterior. To the world, she was just Faye, the girl who blended into the stone walls. But on these pages, she was a judge. I watched from the gallery as Silas whispered his poison into Jax's ear, suggesting the grain stores for the northern borders be diverted for maintenance. Maintenance is a clever word for his own pockets. She gripped the pen like a dagger, the only weapon she had against a man who could order her death with a flick of his wrist. She had seen the truth that no one else dared to acknowledge, and now that truth was sitting on the king's bedside table. The heavy scent of cedar and ozone clung to the air in the high training gallery, a warning that Alpha King Jax was still below, pushing his body to the limits of physical endurance. Faye crouched in the deepest alcove, her breath held so tightly, her chest ached. From this vantage point, she could see the rhythmic play of muscles across his scarred back, the way the torchlight glistened off the sweat of a king who bore the weight of a fracturing realm. To the world, she was merely Faye, the daughter of a silent guard, as invisible as the dust motes dancing in the dark. But in the leather-bound journal clutched to her chest, she was the judge of the High Court. She opened the book, the spine groaning softly, a sound that felt like a thunderclap in the hollow silence of the gym. Her quill moved with frantic grace, capturing the raw power of the man below and the simmering frustration she felt at his blindness toward his uncle Silas. He fights shadows on the stone, while the real monster sits at his right hand, she wrote, her ink bleeding dark into the parchment. He is lethal, beautiful, and utterly oblivious. Jax suddenly went still. The rhythmic thud of the training dummy ceased. Faye froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, Jax turned, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that didn't belong in the rafters, the smell of wild jasmine and cheap ink. His golden eyes, sharp and predatory, tracked upward, locking onto the exact shadow where she knelt. Who's there? His voice was a low, vibrating growl that shook the floorboards beneath her. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. Faye didn't think. She bolted. She scrambled backward, her boots skidding on the stone as she dove for the rear exit of the gallery. Stop, Jax commanded, the alpha tone rippling through the air, demanding obedience. Faye's wolf whined in submission, but her human terror was louder. She threw herself through the narrow door, her shoulder clipping the frame. In the jarring impact, the weight in her arms vanished. She heard the sickening thud of leather hitting the floor, the sound of pages fluttering like dying wings. She reached back blindly, her fingers grazing the edge of the gallery floor, but the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps ascending the wooden stairs sent her spiraling into a blind run. She disappeared into the labyrinth of the servant tunnels, her lungs burning and her hands empty. It was only when she reached the safety of the kitchens that the crushing reality set in. She had escaped the king, but she had left her soul behind in the dark. Every secret she held, every treasonous observation, and every shameful, burning confession of her love for him was now lying at the feet of the Alpha King. The morning sun offered no warmth as it filtered through the high, arched windows of the fortress, casting long, cold shadows that Faye moved through like a ghost. Her chest felt hollow, a physical ache where her journal should have been tucked against her ribs. Every time a heavy boot clicked against the stone or a door creaked open, her heart stuttered, expecting Alpha King Jax to appear with her secrets held in his calloused hand. But the world moved on, indifferent to her ruin. She found her father, Bram, standing at his post near the western gate. He was a man of iron and silence, his back as straight as the spear he gripped. When he saw her, his stern features softened just enough for a daughter to notice. He reached out, his rough thumb brushing a stray hair from her forehead. To the rest of the pack, he was a nameless sentinel, but to Faye, he was the only anchor she had left. He didn't know that his daughter's midnight hobby had put a target on both their backs. He merely nodded, a silent command to stay safe, before his eyes returned to the horizon. Faye's throat tightened. His loyalty was a shield she had unknowingly cracked. Leaving the safety of the inner circle, Faye made her way to the lower courtyard where the commoners gathered. The disparity was a jagged glass in her mind. There, she spotted Nell, a young woman from the southern villages whose family had once been prosperous. Now, Nell's cloak was frayed, and her face bore the gaunt, hollow look of systematic starvation. Faye watched as Nell tried to trade a small, intricately carved pendant for a single sack of bruised grain. The merchant, a man clearly under the thumb of the king's uncle Silas, laughed and pushed her away. Faye saw the flicker of despair in Nell's eyes, the same despair she had documented so fiercely in her missing pages. Silas was bleeding them dry, diverting the pack's wealth into fortification funds that only fortified his own influence. Every word Faye had written about Nell's suffering, about Silas's oily smile and the king's distracted negligence, felt like a burning brand. She walked past the soldiers and the suffering, her jaw tight and her eyes lowered. She was a shadow in the hall, a girl without a voice, but she carried the weight of the kingdom's truth. As she slipped back toward the servant quarters, she realized she couldn't just hide anymore. The Alpha King had her words, and if he chose to read them, he would see the blood on his uncle's hands, or he would see a traitor who needed to be silenced. Either way, the girl in the shadows was gone. The diary had seen to that. In the silence of the training gallery, the air still vibrated with the echo of the girl's flight. Alpha King Jax stood motionless, his chest heaving as he stared at the dark rectangle lying on the stone floor. He had expected an assassin or a spy, but the scent that lingered was not of poison or steel. It was wild jasmine and the sharp metallic tang of fresh ink. He crossed the distance in 2 predatory strides, his large hand dwarfing the leather-bound book as he reclaimed it from the shadows. Back in the solitude of his private solar, Jax slammed the journal onto his mahogany desk. His golden eyes narrowed with a simmer of ancestral rage. He was the Alpha. His privacy was sacrosanct, yet someone had been documenting his every move. He flipped the cover open, expecting to find coded maps or troop movements. Instead, his eyes landed on a passage written in a fierce, elegant hand that seemed to vibrate with suppressed emotion. He stands at the center of the court, like a mountain peak. The entry began, but even mountains are eroded by the wind. Jax ignores the whispers of his counsel because he thinks silence is strength. He doesn't see that Silas is not his shield, but his shroud. Jax's jaw tightened, his claws lengthening as they dug into the edges of the desk. The audacity of a servant, a guard's daughter, to analyze his rule with such blunt, insulting clarity was enough to warrant the dungeons. He turned the page, ready to find more evidence of treason, but his breath hitched as the tone shifted. The ink here was lighter, the script more hesitant, as if the writer were afraid the paper itself might feel her heat. I watched him tonight in the rain, the words read. He looked at the moon as if he were waiting for it to speak a name he's forgotten. There is a hollow in his chest that no crown can fill. He is surrounded by 1,000 loyal wolves, yet he is the loneliest soul in the realm. I want to reach out and touch the scar on his shoulder, not to heal it, but to let him know he isn't the only one who carries the weight of the dead. The fury in Jax's blood began to cool, replaced by a strange, hollow ache that mirrored the words on the page. He sank into his chair, his gaze fixed on the ink-blotted confessions. This girl, this fae who lived in the corners of his castle, had seen past the king, past the Alpha, and straight into the man who was drowning in his own duty. She described his loneliness with a poetic intimacy that made him feel more exposed than any battle ever had. He wasn't just reading a diary, he was looking into a mirror held up by a stranger who knew his soul better than he knew it himself. He closed the book gently this time, his thumb tracing the worn leather, his mind already beginning to hunt for the girl who had dared to see him. Silas moved through the king's private wing with the practiced ease of a man who believed the castle was already his. He didn't need to sneak. His position as the king's most trusted advisor granted him a key to every door and a shield against every suspicious glance. He had watched Jax leave for the dawn council meeting with a preoccupied expression, a look that suggested the Alpha's mind was elsewhere, somewhere far more dangerous than military strategy. Entering Jax's solar, Silas's gaze immediately locked onto the leather-bound book sitting atop the mahogany desk. It looked out of place. Among the official scrolls and heavy ledgers, he crossed the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick rugs, and picked it up. His intentions were purely opportunistic. Jax had been distracted lately, and Silas made it his business to know why. But as he leafed through the pages, the oily smirk on his face curdled into a mask of cold, calculating fury. He saw his own name written in that fierce, defiant hand. He read the precise dates of grain shipments that had never arrived at the northern border. He saw the exact figures of the fortification tax that had ended up in his private coffers. Most damning of all, he saw a list of the contacts he had made with the rival packs, details he thought were buried in the shadows of the southern villages. This wasn't just a diary, it was a roadmap to his execution. "The guard's brat," he hissed, the paper crinkling under his tightening grip. He recognized the descriptions of the training gallery. He knew Bram's daughter, the quiet girl who always seemed to be looking at the floor. He hadn't realized she had been looking at his crimes instead. A lesser man would have burned the book immediately, but Silas was a predator of a different sort. He saw the way the writer spoke of Jax, the yearning, the intimate observations of the king's scars and his solitude. He saw how much Jax had already read, evidenced by the ink stains and the way the spine had been pressed flat at the most personal entries. Jax was vulnerable. The king was clearly enchanted by this girl's brutal truth, and Silas knew exactly how to twist that enchantment into a noose. If he could frame the girl as a spy who had seduced her way into the king's proximity to gather this information, he could discredit the evidence and eliminate the witness in one stroke. He tucked the journal into the deep folds of his robes. He would not destroy it yet. He would wait for the right moment to present it to the council as proof of a grand conspiracy. By the time he was finished, Faye would be a traitor, and Jax would be forced to sign her death warrant to save his own honor. Silas slipped out of the room, his mind already weaving the web that would turn the king's burgeoning hope into a lethal betrayal. The halls of the inner sanctum felt narrower than usual, the stone walls pressing in on Faye as she hurried toward the laundry wing. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor. counting the rhythmic patterns of the masonry to keep her breathing steady. Every shadow seemed to move. Every distant footfall sounded like a judgment. She was nearly to the safety of the servants' stairs when a large, solid silhouette stepped out from the darkness of a recessed archway. Faye gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The air shifted, growing heavy with the scent of rain-drenched earth and the undeniable heat of an alpha. A king ignores the whispers of his council because he thinks silence is strength. A low, gravelly voice vibrated through the corridor. Faye froze, the blood draining from her face. Her pulse hammered against her ears so loudly she thought she might have misheard. Those were her words, the very words she had penned with a trembling hand 3 nights ago. Jax didn't move to block her path, but his presence was a wall of its own. He stepped into a sliver of torchlight, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. "He doesn't see that his shield is actually his shroud," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that felt like a caress and a threat all at once. "Tell me, Faye, does the guard's daughter still think her king is drowning in his own duty?" Faye's knees buckled, and she had to reach out to steady herself against the cold stone wall. Her mind raced, searching for a lie, a denial, anything to bridge the terrifying gap between her private thoughts and his public reality. "My lord, I don't know what you mean," she stammered, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. Jax took a slow step forward, closing the distance until she could feel the radiator-like heat coming off his chest. He leaned down, his lips dangerously close to her ear. "You wrote that there is a hollow in my chest that no crown can fill. You said you wanted to touch the scar on my shoulder just to let me know I wasn't alone." He pulled back just enough to look into her wide, terrified eyes. A dark, enigmatic smile played at the corners of his mouth, a look that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't mercy either. "The weight of a crown is indeed heavy, Faye, but perhaps it is lighter when someone finally dares to describe the burden." Before she could find her voice, he straightened his back and strode past her, the hem of his heavy cloak brushing against her skirt. He left her standing in the shivering silence of the hall, her own secrets echoing back at her from the mouth of the man she had most feared would hear them. She wasn't just a shadow anymore. She was a target, and the king was playing with his prey. The morning air in the great council chamber was thick with the scent of old parchment and impending doom. Faye stood at the periphery, her hands clasped tightly to hide their tremor, as the high-ranking wolves of the pack gathered. She had been summoned under the guise of assisting her father, Bram, with the guard rotation logs, but the moment she saw Silas's oily, triumphant smile, she knew the floor was about to give way. Silas stepped into the center of the ring, holding a weathered leather book aloft, like a trophy of war. "My king, noble elders," he began, his voice projecting a false, heavy grief. "It pains me to bring such darkness into this light, but our safety has been compromised from within. A viper has been nesting in our shadows, documenting our movements, and slandering our crown to facilitate a coup." He opened the journal, Faye's journal, and began to read aloud, but he did not read the parts about the diverted grain or the stolen taxes. Instead, he cherry-picked her most frustrated outbursts, her insults toward the kingdom's leadership, and her intimate observations of Jax's routines. He twisted her words of longing into the cold calculations of a seductress, and her records of his corruption into the reconnaissance of a foreign spy. "This girl," Silas pointed a bare-edged finger directly at Faye, "the daughter of a trusted guard, has been using her proximity to the throne to gather intelligence. She writes of the king's vulnerabilities and the rot of our laws. This is not the work of a diary. It is a dossier for our enemies." A low collective growl rose from the council. Faye felt the weight of 100 accusing stares. She looked toward the throne, desperate to find the man who had quoted her soul back to her in the hallway, but Jax's face was a mask of unreadable stone. His golden eyes were fixed on the book in Silas's hand. His jaw set so tight the muscle leaped in his cheek. "The evidence is irrefutable," Silas barked, sensing the kill. "She has confessed her intent to dismantle our ways on these very pages. I move for her immediate arrest on charges of high treason and espionage." Before Faye could find her voice, 2 heavy-set guards stepped forward. She looked to her father, Bram, whose face was pale with a mix of horror and confusion, his hand hovering uselessly over his sword. The betrayal in the room was a physical force. "Wait." Jax's voice finally cut through the clamor, vibrating with a lethal, quiet authority. But he didn't stop the guards. He merely watched as they gripped Faye's arms, their fingers bruising her skin. "Take her to the high cells. I will examine the intelligence myself before the sun sets." As they dragged her from the chamber, Silas's smirk followed her like a ghost. Faye felt the iron doors of the dungeon slam shut in her mind, long before they reached the stone stairs. She had tried to save the kingdom with the truth, but the truth had been twisted into the very rope they were now using to hang her. The damp chill of the high cells seeped into Faye's bones, but it was the silence that truly terrified her. She sat on the narrow stone bench, her back against the weeping wall, watching the torchlight flicker outside her iron bars. When the heavy boots finally echoed against the spiral stairs, she expected the executioner or Silas's hired blades. Instead, the shadows parted to reveal Alpha King Jax. He didn't speak at first. He stood on the other side of the bars, his presence so immense it seemed to suck the oxygen from the cramped cell. In his hand, he held the journal, its edges frayed from Silas's rough handling. Jax signaled the guards to leave, and once their footsteps faded into the depths of the tower, he opened the book to a page marked with a single dried wildflower. "The way he moves in the training circle is like watching a storm find its rhythm," Jax read. His voice low and vibrating with a strange dark heat. He looked up, his golden eyes searching hers in the gloom. "A lethal, terrifying beauty that makes my heart forget its purpose." Faye felt the heat of 1,000 suns rush to her face. She looked at her feet, her voice a broken whisper. "My lord, please. Silas has already used that book to seal my fate. You don't need to mock me with it." "Mock you?" Jax took a step closer, his hands gripping the iron bars. "You wrote that my eyes look like molten gold when the sun hits them, that you can feel the pull of my soul from across a crowded room. You called me a lonely mountain waiting for the wind." He turned the page, his knuckles white. "Silas calls this espionage. He says these are the observations of a spy looking for a weakness to exploit." "It's not," Faye snapped, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a flare of her characteristic spirit. She stood, crossing the cell until only the iron separated them. "Those aren't weaknesses, Jax. They're the truth. I saw the grain logs because I care about the pack. I wrote about your loneliness because I see you, not the king, but the man." "Then say it," Jax commanded, his alpha aura surging, not to crush her, but to pull the truth from her lungs. "Admit what you wrote on the final page. Admit why the guard's daughter spent her nights in the rafters, watching a man who didn't know she existed." Faye reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the cold iron, inches from his own. "Because I'm yours," she breathed, the confession more terrifying than the prospect of the gallows. "I've been yours since the first day I saw the weight you carry. My loyalty isn't to a crown or a council. It's to you." The silence that followed was charged with a sudden electric tension. Jax didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned his forehead against the bars, his eyes closing as a low, rumbling growl of recognition escaped his chest. "Silas thinks he has found the evidence to destroy you, Faye, but he doesn't realize he's given me the map to save us both." The great hall was packed with a bloodthirsty silence as Faye was led to the center of the mosaic floor, her wrists bound in cold iron. Silas stood at the foot of the throne, his chest puffed out with the self-importance of a man who believed he was about to deliver the final blow. He held Faye's journal aloft, the leather worn and stained, presenting it to the assembled elders as if it were a death warrant written in the girl's own hand. "The evidence is absolute," Silas's voice boomed, echoing off the high stone rafters. "This girl has documented our defenses, slandered our crown, and confessed to a treasonous obsession with our king to mask her true intent. To leave such a spy alive is to invite our own destruction. My king, I demand the sentence of immediate execution. Let her blood wash away the stain of her words." A murmur of agreement rippled through the council, the sound of wolves ready for a cull. Faye looked up, her gaze finding Jax. He sat upon the throne, his expression a mask of terrifying calm, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He let the silence stretch until the tension in the room was a physical weight. Then slowly, he stood. "You speak of truth, Silas," Jax said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "You claim these pages are the work of a spy, but there is a peculiar thing about this intelligence. While you were busy preparing a gallows, I spent the night following the maps she drew with her ink." Jax stepped down from the dais, moving towards Silas with a slow, predatory grace. "I went to the northern storehouses she mentioned. I found them empty. I visited the southern tax collectors she named. I found the ledgers they tried to burn. And I spoke to the villagers she described, the ones you said were prospering, while they were actually starving in the shadows of your greed." The color drained from Silas's face, his hand trembling as he held the book. "My king, she is a manipulator. She has enchanted you with... She has awakened me," Jax roared, his alpha aura exploding outward, forcing the council members to drop their heads in submission. He snatched the journal from Silas's hand. "Everything written in this book is the truth. The treason isn't in these pages, Silas. The treason is in your heart. You didn't steal this book to protect the kingdom. You stole it to hide your own reflection." Jax turned to the guards, his eyes flashing a lethal gold. "Release the girl. Arrest the traitor. Silas has bled this pack for long enough. He will face the judgment he so eagerly sought for an innocent soul." As the guards swarmed Silas, stripping him of his robes of office, Jax crossed the distance to Faye. With a single sharp snap of his fingers, the iron locks on her wrists shattered. He didn't speak, but as he reached out to steady her, his hand lingered against hers, and for the first time, the girl who lived in the shadows saw the mountain bow to the wind. The chaos of the trial subsided into a profound, ringing silence as the sun began to set, casting long amber rays through the hall's high windows. The atmosphere of the castle had shifted. The heavy shroud of Silas's suspicion had lifted, replaced by a cautious, burgeoning hope. Faye stood by the great gate, her breath hitching as she watched Jax approach her father. Bram stood at his post, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had nearly lost everything, yet his back remained unbent. Jax stopped before the old guard, not as a distant monarch, but as an alpha recognizing a brother in arms. Without a word, the king placed a hand on Bram's shoulder, a gesture of respect that silenced the surrounding soldiers. "Loyalty is often tested in the dark, Bram." Jax's voice carried through the courtyard, resonant and clear. "You held your post while your heart was being torn out. For your steadfastness and for raising the voice that saved this realm, you are hereby named Commander of the Royal Guard." Faye watched her father's eyes glisten, a rare break in his iron composure, as he bowed his head, not in submission, but in deep, earned pride. But the restoration didn't stop at the castle walls. Jax turned his attention to Nell and the small group of villagers who had been brought in as witnesses. He promised the immediate release of the grain stores and the return of every coin Silas had bled from the southern borders. The look of disbelief and joy on Nell's face was the first true victory Faye's words had ever won. As the moon began to rise, Jax found Faye near the parapets. He didn't summon her. He simply waited until she followed the pull of his presence. He led her to the high balcony overlooking the sprawling lights of the kingdom, the wind whipping his heavy cloak around them both. From the folds of his tunic, he pulled out the leather-bound journal. It was battered and the edges were scorched, but to Faye, it looked like a holy relic. "You dropped this in the dark," Jax said, his voice dropping to that intimate vibrating register that always made her skin tingle. He held it out, but as her fingers brushed the leather, he didn't let go immediately. "I read the final entries again today. After the trial, after seeing the truth you forced me to acknowledge." Faye looked up, her heart hammering. And I realized that while you were watching me from the shadows, I was blind to the only person who truly understood the man beneath the crown. He placed the book in her hands, his touch lingering. "Keep writing, Faye. This kingdom needs your truth. And I find I have grown quite fond of the way you describe my eyes." The shared look between them was no longer one of hunter and prey, but of two souls finally standing in the light. For the first time, Faye didn't feel like a girl hiding in the halls. She felt like the heartbeat of the castle itself. The moon hung low and heavy over the castle spires, bathing the stone balcony in a pale, ethereal light that seemed to isolate Faye and Jax from the rest of the world. The distant sounds of the celebration below, the cheers for the new Commander Bram, and the relief of the villagers were nothing more than a hum against the sudden electric stillness between them. Faye gripped the worn leather of her returned journal, her thumb brushing the jagged edge of the final page. She felt exposed, yet for the first time in her life, she did not want to run. Jax took a slow step toward her, the heat radiating from his massive frame, chasing away the night's chill. He reached out, his large hand gently tilting her chin upward until she was forced to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, swirling with an intensity that made her wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin. "There is one more thing," Jax whispered, his voice like the low roll of thunder. "A sentence that haunted me more than all the secrets of my uncles: treachery. It was the very last thing you wrote before the ink ran dry." Faye's breath hitched. She knew exactly which words he meant. They were the words written in a moment of absolute despair, the ultimate confession of a girl who believed she was destined to live and die in the periphery of a great man's life. Jax leaned in, his lips inches from hers, and quoted the line with a reverence that broke her heart and healed it all at once. "I belong to a king who doesn't know I exist." He shook his head slowly, a dark, primal smile touching his lips. "You were wrong, Faye. You don't belong to a king. You belong to me. And I have seen you in every shadow, felt your gaze in every hallway, and searched for the owner of this soul long before I ever held your book in my hands." As he spoke, a sudden blinding heat erupted in Faye's chest, spreading through her veins like liquid fire. The air around them seemed to shimmer with an ancient golden power. The invisible girl felt the tether snap into place, the fated mate bond, dormant and waiting, finally recognizing its match. "You are not a shadow," Jax vowed, his voice growing thick with the Alpha's authority and a lover's promise. "You are my Luna, my mate, my queen." At his words, their eyes flared simultaneously, not the ordinary hazel of a guard's daughter or the standard amber of a king, but a brilliant molten gold that illuminated the darkness. The bond was sealed, written no longer in ink on a hidden page, but in the very blood and spirit of the two wolves standing on the precipice of a new era. Faye let the journal slip from her hand, the secrets within it no longer needed, as she stepped into the arms of the king who finally, truly knew she existed.